All right, so Laura asks, what do you think about adrenal insufficiency? And so we'll start out by discussing adrenal sufficiency versus adrenal fatigue. I'm not sure if she was maybe meaning more so adrenal fatigue, but we'll talk about the differences there and then dig into what we think about it. And Mike, I'll let you start us off.
So the adrenal insufficiency is a clinical diagnosis. This is actually a pretty severe health issue. And basically what it is it's a failure of the adrenal gland to produce the important hormones. And so there's a couple hormones. One of them is aldosterone, or it's called a mineralocorticoid. Another one is cortisol, which is a glucocorticoid. Then we have the androgens, which is dehydroepiandrosterone, which is DHEA. And then we have the catecholamines, which is epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so when you're in adrenal insufficiency, there's problems with a variety of these different hormones, their production, their release, etc. And it can lead to a variety of pretty severe symptoms like hypoglycemia, fatigue, weakness, dehydration, low blood sodium levels, altered blood potassium levels, low blood pressure, dizziness, and shock, cardiovascular collapse. So basically you can't maintain your blood pressure, can't maintain perfusion to your brain and to different organs. And so it's a very severe issue. And this is a bit different than adrenal fatigue, which we'll dive into in just a second. Now, with adrenal insufficiency, there can be problems not only at the adrenal gland, but you can also have problems at the pituitary gland or the hypothalamus. And this will differentiate between primary, secondary, and tertiary adrenal insufficiency. And it's basically just saying where the problem is. And the reason why is the hypothalamus produces a hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone that acts on the pituitary gland to release ACTH, which is adrenal corticotropin hormone that stimulates the adrenal gland to produce these hormones. And so if the hypothalamus is damaged or the pituitary is damaged or the adrenal gland is damaged, the whole system can be dysregulated. And then you can have this pretty significant hormonal imbalance. Now, some of the causes that we see with the adrenal insufficiency are related to being on long-term glucocorticoid therapy. So taking the synthetic glucocorticoid steroids like cortisone or dexamethasone or something like this over the long term and then abruptly withdrawing, because the use of these hormones actually lowers our adrenal function. And when you withdraw or abruptly, the adrenals have been atrophied. They're not producing enough hormone and you're left without adequate amounts of these specific hormones. This is very different from something like adrenal fatigue, because most of these problems are very severe. The adrenal insufficiency can be life-threatening, and the symptoms that you can get from it can be like pretty life-altering and outside of just having fatigue or increased risk of infections where you see the adrenal fatigue component. So it's very important to delineate between the two. Now, moving on to, or I guess before I jump into adrenal fatigue, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that perspective, Jay.
I mean, first, even just in talking about adrenal fatigue, this is not a generally recognized condition, but it is a set of symptoms that does occur. And so, yeah, we can talk about that next. Go ahead.
So let's talk about adrenal fatigue first before we get into some of the qualms. But the idea of adrenal fatigue is that you've been under such stress that the adrenal gland just burns out. And then that leads to the low cortisol levels and things like this. And I think, this may partly be the case because we see with different individuals that their response to stress can be lowering of these hormones or raising of these hormones. People will respond a bit differently with the chronic long-term stress. And then the profile that they present with will also be different versus having fatigue or developing metabolic syndrome or things like this. But the general idea with adrenal fatigue is basically chronic long-term stress. You work through kind of the general adaptation syndrome and you reach this fatigue stage. And the problem I have with it, though, is not necessarily this idea that it occurs, but like why it occurs and what are the solutions to address it. And a lot of times the solutions are like, let's just replace with glucocorticoid hormones. Like, let's give you some prednisone. Let's give you some adrenal gland extract. And the thing is that's not taken into consideration with this perspective is that you are under chronic exposure to these hormones in the first place for a period of time. And these hormones have a damaging effect on the mitochondria and the cells in the body in general. And so to say, oh, look, it's just low, let me replace this low hormone so that you can drive stress even further, it just doesn't make any sense. Especially, again, if this is insufficiency, different story. But with the idea of adrenal fatigue, the goal would be to just lower the stressor. So bring the stressors down bring, whether that's work stress, whether that's exercise, whether that's keto, whether that's carnivore, whether that's fasting, whether that's caloric restriction, whatever the thing is, take yourself out of the stress. And then what you do is you have to recover. So what you want to do is you want to support the hormonal systems. That doesn't mean with more glucocorticoids. There's a variety of other components that would be helpful to actually minimize these effects of the glucocorticoids, like DHEA, like pregnenolone, like thyroid, like androgens if necessary, depending on what else is going on in your system. These things, plus the dietary changes, lifestyle changes, stress minimization, light exposure, rest, taking time off, allowing your body to rest, and then giving yourself time and consistency with these things will help to dig you out of the hole. Whereas just taking this Band-Aid glucocorticoid will actually probably make the hole worse. As we've talked about in other episodes, the effects of chronic glucocorticoids and catecholamines on the mitochondria is mitochondrial damage, mitochondrial DNA damage. So driving that further is highly problematic. And then I think what people start to see is you keep driving that, and then you become unresponsive to the hormones.
Right, exactly. That's a great summary and juxtaposition. And so just to zoom out a little bit and talking about what drives this kind of exhaustion stage and what's actually going on more fundamentally, and even to take a step from that too, the idea that these hormones are low, so we should just replace them, and let's call this, this unique diagnosis of adrenal fatigue that your doctors won't recognize and don't know anything about this. So we're on the forefront of this kind of alternative health world. It's like this is an extremely allopathic approach disguised as something that is more holistic, right? This is a situation where you're seeing low adrenal hormones, so let's replace them. And that is, in most cases, the extent of it. And as you're saying, not a good idea. It actually can drive the pathology and make it worse, even though it can help with symptoms. And secondarily, it doesn't do anything to get at the underlying issues. And so in terms of talking about the underlying issues, we have to start with what causes this exhaustion. And before that, we have to talk about what causes stress. But to keep it kind of more general here, stress is essentially an energy deficit, right? Our demands are greater than our supply. And we have two sides there. Either there can be excess demands, or there can be less supply, or it can be a combination of those two things. And when we have that situation go on an ongoing basis, we have an ongoing energy deficiency, we dig into deeper and deeper layers of stress, and the adrenal hormones, within the adrenal hormones or within the stress hormones, there are layers, right? So first we have glucagon, then we have epinephrine, then we have cortisol in order of kind of the depth of the stress response. But on a broader sense, as you get deeper into stress, we shift into deeper and deeper stress mechanisms. And eventually you can get to the place where we've already tried those. We've already tried the cortisol, for example, and it's not working, and it ends up kind of decreasing, and we end up really going into like a deep hibernation state because our bodies recognize that they don't have the energy available to handle the energy demands. And so instead of trying to continually react to it and respond to it and trying to, quote, fight it or make up for that deficiency, the body hits a point where it realizes that this is not working, we can't handle it, and we just need to conserve. We just need to conserve and hope that we can kind of weather out the storm. And that's essentially what we're getting at in an adrenal fatigue state. And to call it adrenal fatigue is, I think, missing the point, right? That is a feature of what goes on, but we're also going to see a lot of other features. We're generally going to see way turned down reproductive hormones. We're going to see turned down thyroid hormone production and activity. We're going to see a lot of different pathology going on. And so we can call it adrenal fatigue if you want. I mean, I don't think it's a great way to characterize it. And part of the reason is because it leads to this idea that we need to focus on the adrenals, that the adrenals are the problem here, when the adrenals are just a part of the stress response, not the entire thing, but a part of the stress response that occurs due to the energy deficit, the energy deficiency. And that's where we want to put our focus. And just providing the cortisol or replenishing these adrenal hormones will help short term in helping you be able to function, but it's coming at a cost. Anytime that we don't have the energy available and we're relying on the stress hormones, we are taking that fuel and energy from other areas that vitally need it to force ourselves to be able to, let's say, move, right? To be able to walk or exercise or whatever it is that we're trying to do. And again, there might be a case where that's our only option to work our way out. Like we can get in such a vicious circle where you can be so fatigued that you can't eat a good diet effectively and you can't get in the sun, and it can really become a pretty rough problem. And maybe for a short period of time, you want to use a Band-Aid like a glucocorticoid, but A, it should never be the first thing, and B, it should be only temporary and as minimal as possible. And what we would want to do instead is focus on fixing the underlying energy deficit. And as you said, Mike, one thing that's important is taking ourselves away from the stressors, removing the demands. And those demands can be everything from exercise to psychological stress, any sort of work, infections, all sorts of different things, all sorts of things in our environment that can increase the utilization of energy. So we want to remove those. But on the other side, we need to improve our energy availability, or improve our energy production. And that's the key thing that is almost never talked about when it comes to adrenal fatigue. And so on that front, this is the thing that we talk about all the time. Of course, we want to be making sure that we're eating adequate calories, we have good macronutrient balance, balanced blood sugar, we're digesting our food well, not being flooded with endotoxin and other bacterial products. We want to make sure we're getting enough calories in, and on and on. But that's, I would say, of utmost importance when we're dealing with this sort of issue. And that is the way that we will be able to recover from the long-term energy debt, the long-term energy deficiency or deficit, and be able to get out of this state. And as we're both, as we've said each once now, using adrenal hormones in this state is something that we generally not recommend unless it's necessary, and be very careful with, and recognize the cost that comes with it. That doesn't mean that there's never a place for it, but there is a cost to using it, and it's not the ideal method if we don't need to go that direction. Coming back to the kind of approach to this. So just to be clear, there's sometimes people will use something like prednisone, which I think is more well known that this is a glucocorticoid, but a lot of times desiccated adrenal will be given, which it's important to recognize that this has those stress hormones in there and is just like giving something like prednisone, of course, not as strong. And so you'd want to be looking at any of those products, even if they're considered to be natural, it's still the same stress hormones. There's also licorice is often given, which has a compound in it called glyceric acid, which increases cortisol. There's also an available form of the licorice called DGL, which has that glyceric acid removed, which doesn't have that effect. But in this case, oftentimes the regular licorice is given. And so there's a number of different kind of even natural supplements that are given to increase the stress hormones, which is having the same effect. Whether it's natural or artificial is not important here. What's important is the fact that you are increasing a system that has been turned down in an adaptive way to protect yourself. So we want to be very careful about doing that. And you were saying, Mike, with looking at the ratios of the different markers and considering that there's generally clear hypothyroidism here, clear hypogonadism here, we can look to support those as well. And I would definitely want to support those before the stress hormones. But as you also highlighted, and I just want to make sure this is very clear, it's really, really important to get the foundations in place first, make sure you are doing everything you can to support having adequate energy, supply and production before adding those in. Because if you don't, and you're still in that low energy state and you add testosterone or you add thyroid hormones, you're still going to end up driving a lot of stress and still going to be forcing yourself to direct energy toward dealing with the current stressors at the expense of vital function, at the expense of other organ systems that are currently trying to be spared, right? That's the whole point of turning everything down. That's that kind of hibernation state. So we still want to be really careful with those two and make sure that if we are going to use those, it's done at the right time. So I wanted to make sure that was clear. And then also, I have seen some people suggest that there's no such thing as adrenal fatigue. It's just hypothyroidism. And as we're saying here, normally those things go hand in hand, right? There's often, you kind of need to have turned down thyroid to get to a point where you're in adrenal fatigue. It's basically a requirement. But again, two things to mention. One, this is kind of a step further potentially, or at least a version of hypothyroidism. And you can have hypothyroidism without the quote adrenal fatigue presentation. But also, as I was just saying, that does not mean we just throw thyroid hormones into the mix. We want to make sure that we're treating the whole system. Considering that there is hypothyroidism present, we want to be very careful about using that, like using thyroid hormones. And we had a pretty extensive series talking about hypothyroidism as well that I'll link to for more information on that.
Yeah. I want to just bring one point here that I think is often missed with all of these things. And you highlighted it earlier, Jay, where you're talking about the central piece here is energy. It is energy supply and demand. So the solution to these things is not bringing more hormones on board that cannibalize your tissues to provide the energy. It is providing the exogenous energy and lowering the demand. Because the problem is oftentimes in either an excess demand or not enough supply or a combination of both. And so this is why, a lot of people gloss over the importance of diet in some of these things. Like, it's like, oh, do keto, do carnivore, do Mediterranean diet. It's like that. And it's like, actually, some of the most fundamental, most important pieces to actually dial in is the diet, because a lot of the hormonal systems are completely organized around energy supply and fuel supply and things like this. And so it's like, if you want to fix underlying logistical problems in the body that are centered around energy and supply and demand, you need to change energy supply and demand. You don't want to add more backup pathways. You want to fundamentally fix the underlying problem, which is why I think fixing what's going on with the diet is so important. And the other thing is, if you're going to throw thyroid and testosterone or some of these different components, pregnenolone, DHEA, whatever it is, on a super stressed system and not fix the underlying supply and demand, you're going to shunt those things and convert them into compounds that you do not want, whether that is estradiol, whether that are glucocorticoids, whether it's any of these different components, because the stress hormones themselves and the state is basically directing the hormones and these signaling molecules down the different pathways depending upon what you have going on. Now, this doesn't mean, I know there's this whole pregnenolone seal thing, so I'm not saying that you just take pregnenolone and it straight goes to cortisol. What I am saying, though, is that if you can get pretty gnarly symptoms, for example, using thyroid, if you don't have enough energy on board, you get palpitations, you get anxiety. And there's reasons why I've talked about this before with the sympathetic nervous system, or with testosterone. I see a lot of guys like, oh, I have these symptoms, I'm not feeling good, TRT. And then they get on TRT and it's like, wow, your estrogen is really high. And then they go on the aromatase inhibitor and they like have this up and down all the time with their aromatase inhibitor and their testosterone to figure out their estrogen. And it's like, or you maybe just fix the underlying reasons that's causing you to aromatase appropriately, and also sometimes how the testosterone is administered drives estrogen production. But this is what we're seeing is, if the state is bad, if the context of the body is bad and you throw things into it and you're not fixing that context, that can be a part of fixing the context, but if you're not fixing that overall context, you can get unintended consequences that can make things worse. And I've seen this happen with guys who have gone on hormones. So the doctor put them on HCG and DHEA when they're super stressed out. And then it's like, wow, look how high this estrogen gets. And now the guy is having pretty severe emotional breakdowns and psychological symptoms because estrogen is through the roof. And it's like, you made it worse because you fundamentally, the individual, the guy just wanted help, but the practitioner fundamentally didn't understand why his stuff was low and how to go about it. And then it causes problems. I've seen this HCG thing multiple times, or the Clomid stuff, or the like DHEA high dose, or the adrenal. Like, I have clients I work with, they got prednisone because they were adrenal fatigued and it made them worse. It drove the stress worse. They gave them mania. They got insomnia, all these types of problems. Because again, it's driving the same problems. And that's why the context and the energy supply piece being central is so key.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And just to clarify two quick things before we move on to the next question. First was, you were talking about like the conversion of the hormones to the stress hormones, but the real concern is just the increased production of those stress hormones, and don't want to get too far on this tangent, but as you said, we can provide thyroid hormones, which are not precursors to adrenaline or cortisol or estrogen, but still have increases in those things if we don't have the energy supply to make up for that demand. That creates signals that drives the stress hormone production. Same thing if we're talking about testosterone or pregnenolone. It's not a concern necessarily that they will directly be converted, but rather if you are adding, those things add energy demands, and if we don't have the supply there, if we haven't fixed anything on that front, we will increase the production of the stress hormones, potentially directly from them, but that's not even the point. The point is, like, it can be produced elsewhere from other hormones. It's just that production that's driven by the signal of the energy deficit. That's the real focus. And again, not going too far down the path, but the hormones like pregnenolone actually help to prevent the production of the stress hormones but an energy deficit will override that signal. So that's the kind of balance there.